155 people left from New York Airport on a winter afternoon, unaware that shortly after takeoff, something extremely unlikely would happen. It was so unlikely it wasn't considered possible. What they also weren't aware of was the professionalism of everyone who would become involved. On that day, the pilots, cabin crew, air traffic controllers, and rescuers in New York City would demonstrate unmatched preparedness. A story that, because of Tom Hanks, we remember with false facts. Today, let me take you through it minute by minute. On that flight, we'll see what is true about what was shown in the movie and why this flight is more than worthy of being known as the Miracle on the Hudson River. January 15, 2009 was a cold morning with some layers of clouds over New York City, a typical winter day. At noon, the thermometer read 5 degrees below zero, and this temperature was going to be a key factor in what would happen just moments later. Just 8 years earlier, New York City had become the center of attention because of the September 2001 attacks, but that city was about to be in the spotlight once again. But this time, it was for something good. At 3:03 in the afternoon, an Airbus A320 from United States Airways was getting ready to take off from LaGuardia Airport. Just 5 kilometers from Manhattan Island, full of skyscrapers, the aircraft that day had been in operation for almost 10 years. On that flight, there would be 150 passengers, 3 cabin crew, and 2 pilots, totaling 155 people. The captain seated on the left was Chesley Burnett Sullenberger, also known as Sully, 57 years old and with 19,663 flight hours under his belt. In addition, before becoming a commercial pilot, he had been a pilot in the United States Air Force, flying the F-4 Phantom leading international military exercises and serving as a mission commander. As the captain that day, the responsibility for the aircraft was his, and he was the highest authority on board. The first officer, or colloquially called the co-pilot, was seated on the right and was Jeffrey Bruce Skiles, 49 years old with 15,643 flight hours, although only 37 hours on the Airbus A320. That is, he had just obtained his license for that model of aircraft. On every flight, one of the pilots acts as the pilot flying, meaning they fly the plane, and the other acts as the pilot monitoring. This usually means using the radio, reviewing checklists, etc. On that particular flight, the role of pilot flying would be done by the co-pilot, and Sully would be the pilot monitoring. At 3 p.m., the pilots were on the aircraft getting it ready for takeoff and communicating with the control tower as usual. Also that day, the plane would be very heavy, within limits, but near maximum weight. The planned route was to fly to Seattle, with a stopover in Charlotte, to drop off some passengers along the way. That's why the destination of this flight is sometimes confused, but officially it was Charlotte. At approximately 3:25 post-meridian, they received clearance from the control tower to take off on the runway. 10 seconds after receiving clearance, they apply maximum power to the engines and release the brakes. The plane begins to accelerate little by little until it reaches rotation speed to lift the nose and take off. After leaving the airport, they made a slight left turn. Little by little, the plane continued climbing normally, and once they reached about 2,300 feet, they retracted the flaps and checked that everything was correct. The captain finished the after takeoff checklist and confirmed everything was in order at 15:27:07. But just 3 seconds after that message, the worst happened. From here on, I want to teleport you into that cockpit so you can see firsthand what was experienced. Specifically, we're going to put ourselves in Sully's point of view so you can understand why this case is known as the Miracle on the Hudson. What you're about to see next is a recreation based on real data with black boxes. After finishing the post-takeoff checklist, you spot a flock of birds and warn the co-pilot, but it's already too late. Suddenly, you hear several impacts on the plane, sounding like explosions. A few seconds later, you feel sudden deceleration and the engine noise quickly fades. Have you ever felt anything like this? You look at the engine indicator and see how the power of one of them starts to drop, so you tell the co-pilot, But at that very moment, you see the indicator for the other engine, and you realize that actually both engines have failed. So you correct yourself and tell him that both engines have failed. At that moment, you press the engine restart switch and soon decide to start the auxiliary power unit. Looking out the window, you see buildings surrounding you. At that moment, the plane has already stopped climbing and you are starting to descend. As the captain and the person ultimately responsible, you decide to take control of the plane, saying, "My plane." From that moment on, you become the pilot flying and you tell the co-pilot to open the emergency manual and look under the section for loss of thrust. On both engines, you radio Mayday, report power loss from a bird strike, and request help to return to LaGuardia Airport. The controller instructs you to head 220, so you begin turning left to follow that direction. Meanwhile, you see how the co-pilot carries out the dual engine failure checklist. He says to maintain 300 knots, but you're flying at 210 knots. Reaching 300 is impossible. Over the radio, the controller tells you that you can try to land on runway 13. You see it in the distance, so far away that you realize it's impossible to reach, and without hesitation, you say it's not feasible. You see the Hudson River ahead and radio that you may land there. The co-pilot keeps doing everything he can from the checklist and changes the transponder code to 7700, the emergency code, over the radio. They tell you to turn left to enter runway 31, but again you communicate that it's not possible. You look at the instruments, you keep seeing the altitude drop, but the only thing that matters to you is maintaining speed so you can maneuver. The co-pilot says the controller likely meant runway 13. You look to your left. Have you already assumed you won't reach the front? You see Manhattan's buildings and recall Teterboro Airport is to the right. You radio in and they ask if you want to try landing there. You say yes. At that moment, you're flying over the Hudson River. With a brief pause while waiting for the controller's instructions, you use the time to speak to the passengers. Brace for impact. In the background, you can hear multiple alarms from the plane, and on the electronic centralized aircraft monitor screen, multiple failures appear in red. The co-pilot tries everything to start an engine, but nothing works. Suddenly, the radio says you can land on runway 1 at Teterboro, but you reply it's impossible since you know you wouldn't make it. The co-pilot asks if you want to restart engine 1 since it's not providing power, and you agree. Then, over the radio, they ask which Teterboro runway you want. You reply that you're heading to the Hudson, but the controller doesn't understand and asks you to repeat. You don't respond because you're focused on keeping your speed above stall. You ask the co-pilot to set the flaps as the controller lists runway options, but you've already decided you won't make it and don't process the information. Alarms in the plane warn that the ground is too close and to pull up just as the flaps finish lowering. The co-pilot asks if you want more flaps, but you decline and keep them at 2. You ask if he has any ideas, but he says no. The speed is already very low and you're just a few meters above the river. You tell the co-pilot to brace for impact, and in the next 5 seconds, the plane hits the water. As you can see, from Sully's perspective, there were a few seconds with no pause, but why is it considered a miracle? The reality is that among all the steps you've seen, there were 4 that made the difference between a tragedy and a miracle. The first thing is that Sully realizes extremely quickly that the failure is affecting both engines. Exactly, 4 seconds, just 4 seconds. Both pilots knew the problem while flying over one of the world's most densely populated cities. Every second mattered. The next major and likely most crucial decision comes when, just 10 seconds after impact, Sully turns on the auxiliary power unit. The auxiliary power unit is a generator that airplanes have in the tail. It's like a small engine whose purpose is to provide power to the aircraft. Under normal conditions, an airplane gets its power from its engines, but since they had lost them, Sully realized that he was definitely going to need power to be able to fly the plane. If he hadn't acted, the plane would have relied only on the ram air turbine, a small propeller that extends from the fuselage and spins from airspeed. The issue is that this system powers only essential systems, making the plane much harder to maneuver. The Airbus A320 has many computer protections during normal flight. This means that even if the pilot pulls the controls as hard as possible, the plane won't surpass a set angle of attack. In other words, it protects the plane within safe parameters, but when relying exclusively on the ram air turbine's power, these protections disappear and the plane becomes much harder to fly. Thanks to having started the auxiliary power unit, the descent could be made with all those protections. This way, the plane could be kept within safe speed and angle of attack parameters. It was much easier, and Sully was able to focus on thinking about all the options instead of just flying the plane. The third major point is that Sully realizes they won't make it back to LaGuardia Airport, therefore he decides not to head there. He's aware that they won't make it. Would that mean crashing into buildings? Faced with this, he stays over the Hudson, considering other airports which also weren't viable. The key is that he doesn't hesitate to refuse the airport runways, rather than rushing blindly toward what seemed like the only way to return. The fourth point is he chooses flaps 2 instead of maximum flaps, as the checklist indicated. This is another unique decision. The logical thing might have been to extend them all the way. The plane could have flown slower, but Sully knew what mattered was descending slowly at impact, not moving forward slowly. If they descended too quickly, the fuselage could break apart when crashing into the water, and that would have been fatal. He wanted to lift the plane's nose at the last moment to slow its descent, a maneuver called a flare, but he needed speed for that. Flaps 2 was a better choice than flaps for this reason. Later we'll see why the checklist says flaps to maximum. These 4 points made the miracle possible, but there are other important ones too. For example, he asked the co-pilot if he had any ideas, not with the goal of the co-pilot coming up with a new idea that could solve the problem, but to ask him and let him express himself openly. Just in case, he considered whether there was any step that hadn't been carried out correctly. However, the co-pilot had nothing to add. After the accident, an investigation evaluated all decisions made that day. Aviation is very safe because serious incidents are investigated as thoroughly as accidents, with 155 fatalities. With this investigation, they aim to assess if the decisions were correct and identify lessons learned. For this, several tests were carried out in flight simulators, replicating the same conditions from the moment of impact and varying the pilot's decisions to see what would have happened if other decisions had been made. The plane impacted this area while flying in this direction at around 2,800 feet altitude and 210 knots. From there, power was cut to both engines, and they tried to reach runway 22 at LaGuardia, turning to the right. They also tried to return by turning left, entering runway 13 and both runways at Teterboro. This was repeated by turning immediately after the engine failed, and then repeated again, all with a 35-second delay before the pilot turned, simulating a much more realistic situation in which the pilots first assess the damage after the impact and then take action. What was seen is that if they had turned around at the moment the failure occurred, they would have been able to land at LaGuardia Airport. However, by leaving that 35-second delay, none of the pilots who tried it in the simulator managed to make it. They couldn't make it to Teterboro Airport even by turning right after the failure, though returning to LaGuardia was physically possible. When a commercial airplane fails, pilots first assess the issue and its impact, which logically takes a few seconds. Therefore, it's not realistic to turn around immediately. Aviation doesn't work that way. Pilots wouldn't turn around without first checking a cockpit problem. Therefore, it was proven that Sully made the best decision. The other relevant point is that Sully was a military pilot. He flew the F-4 Phantom, a 1950s fighter jet with no automation. In those years, Sully not only learned how to fly, but also how to fight in the air, where there are hundreds of factors at every moment. But Sully wasn't just a combat pilot, he was a mission commander. This is the lead plane of a fighter formation that has to constantly analyze the situation on the battlefield, while carrying out his own mission to command the other planes. In other words, he was used to multitasking while flying. In addition, military pilots are specially trained to handle emergencies, since when flying in combat, it's possible that their plane could take some kind of damage. This factor was clear and helped with decision making that day. A commercial pilot is trained for emergencies, but his military combat background clearly helped him make calm, final decisions. Something incredible is that during takeoff, before the bird strike happened at about 2,000 feet, Sully glanced left, saw the Hudson River, and remarked, "Oh wow, we have Hudson River views today." 30 seconds later, the bird strike happened. Probably thanks to having said that out loud, he quickly thought of the option of going to the Hudson. How can some birds cause a plane with 155 people to crash? We all ask ourselves this question when considering this case. Unfortunately, bad luck was undeniable that day. Planes undergo bird strike tests, in which birds are launched against different parts of the plane. The size of the birds used depends on the size of the engine, the A320. At that time, tests had been done with birds weighing about 1 kilogram, but the birds that day were Canadian geese that could weigh up to 4 kilograms. This is known because the feathers found in the plane's wreckage were analyzed. The birds got sucked into the compressor. Normally, they just hit the fan. So that day, a huge flock of massive birds gathered, and at least 2 of them went right into the center of each engine. If only one engine had failed, the incident would have been easily resolved, and we likely wouldn't have heard about that flight. Sully, that day he was forced to improvise, and that was because the checklists he was supposed to follow weren't designed for such an extreme case in the dual engine failure checklist. One of the first steps is to maintain a speed of 300 knots to try to restart an engine. But that day the plane was going at 210 knots and flying very low, so it was impossible to gain more speed. So the checklist is wrong, isn't it? It was made for a situation where... and I don't know how to do anything. A maximum flap configuration was supposed to be set, but if you remember, Sully preferred to stay with flaps 2. That is less than what the checklist said. The problem is that Airbus assumed that in a ditching emergency, the plane would have at least one engine operating, and it could maintain a 1-degree glide slope and a descent rate of 200 feet per minute. According to studies that had been done on ditchings, with that slope and speed, the plane wouldn't even have broken apart. But without power, because neither of the 2 engines was working, it was impossible to maintain a 1-degree glide angle. So, to avoid stalling, the plane had to lower its nose even more, resulting in a 3.5-degree slope. This meant a descent rate of 750 feet per minute, 3 times faster than what Airbus had specified. In fact, the plane was actually descending at a rate of 1,200 feet per minute. But at the last moment, Sully pulled back on the controls to reduce it to 750 feet per minute. Flair couldn't have made that move if he had been using the flaps 3 configuration, because he would have been flying with a higher angle of attack. And the plane wouldn't have let him raise the nose, precisely because of the angle of attack protections. In the event of a stall, the Airbus A320 was designed to land on water without breaking apart if flown with the ideal parameters, but since the speed was much higher. The plane broke apart at the rear at the moment of impact, so water started to enter the aircraft. While the evacuation process was underway, everyone's fear became that the aircraft would sink with everyone on board. During the evacuation, the cabin crew organized everything perfectly, and everyone left the aircraft within minutes, through the front and middle doors, as the rear doors were blocked by the impact. People started to stay on the wings, and others remained on the inflatable slides. Designed to become rafts in case of a water landing, fortunately that plane had those rafts. But this is not mandatory on all Airbus A320s. Does whether it's mandatory depend on your route? For that day's route, it wasn't required. But even so, the Airbus A320 did have them, fortunately. If it hadn't had them, the evacuation would have been much more chaotic. The outside temperature was about 6 degrees below zero, and the water was around 5 degrees. With those temperatures, jumping into the Hudson River to escape wasn't an option. Fortunately, the first boats arrived at the crash site just 2 minutes after the impact. And in about 20 minutes, the entire evacuation was carried out and everyone was able to get out unharmed. The movie Sully portrays this event in an incredibly realistic way. The flight part is almost identical to the real conversations, practically word for word. However, in the movie, the National Transportation Safety Board, the organization that investigates the accident, is portrayed as if they wanted to blame the captain for the decision to go to the river. This was not the case under any circumstances. Just as we've said, there was an investigation, but it quickly became clear that Sully made the best decision of all. The public hearing in which he was interviewed is on YouTube, and you can see at all times how the questions are respectful and aimed at learning from that accident for the future. Some checklist steps were changed, like the order of starting the auxiliary power unit, and new procedures were recommended to certify the engines and other aircraft systems. There was a video circulating on the internet showing the flight path of the plane, along with the radio communications, but in that video only the messages between the control tower and the captain appear. I made an updated version that includes all messages between the captain and co-pilot, so the stressful situation they faced can be understood. The reality is that after a lifetime dedicated to aviation, we all know Captain Sullenberg for just 200 seconds of his entire career. It's easy to judge others' actions from a safe, stress-free position at the crucial moment. Piloting a multi-ton plane with 155 people over the most populated United States city, his hand never trembled. If Sullenberg had followed what seemed logical on paper, New York would be remembering yet another tragedy today. Instead, he let his experience, cool mind, and training guide him to the best decision. And that's why today we all know this case as the Miracle on the Hudson River.